of those maps that are available at YMCA's and libraries as well.
Can people post on the website when they look at the map? Do they have a way of putting up a comment?
You can comment.
And so I'm just wondering what the number is of comments like that and emails that we've had from people who didn't participate in meetings. Is it like 100, 800? Do we know?
I don't have that, unfortunately, right now at the tip of my fingers, but I'm happy to find that out for you.
Thank you.
So what we can do, Councilmember Driggs, is on Friday when we send our weekly email that Renata referred to earlier, probably this Friday we'll be able to give you that quantification in terms of what we're getting online-wise, the comment. Thank you.
I think it's good news if it's not much in the sense that there doesn't seem to be an uprising, but it could also be bad news to the extent that people aren't paying attention. So I just want to get a feel for the public response. Thank you.
I had a question. Could you give me like a quick example of the difference between a neighborhood activity center and a community activity center?
Sure. So the neighborhood activity center is really smaller and more immediate serving. A commercial activity center typically would be something that have like larger uses, like maybe a grocery store, maybe a couple of uses that size. And additionally, so it has a larger draw and a larger footprint. Typically, it might have some either as part of it or surrounded by some neighborhood too.
With the, you said that what's mapped as parks and preserves. Sorry, how did you come up with those parcels on the 2040 policy map? Because there's a lot more than what is on the adopted policy maps. And you're just saying because adopted policy, it's zoned N or R3, and so you're just recoding that based on what is open space right now?
Yes, and by size, so if it's over 10 acres.
Okay, so that, I'm just wondering what the implications are going to be of that, because 10 acres is awfully big, and like yesterday we saw that little pocket park at the Innovation Corridor, which was I think 1.5 acres, and going forward, you know, if we add more green space to parts of town that don't have green space, we'll be lucky to get a couple of acres here or there, but if we can't code it for parks and preserves, we don't really have a tool to preserve green space.
Sure. So this can be slightly confusing too, in that there could smaller parks. So a park like you're describing most often would be a secondary use in another place type. So most of the place types have primary uses and secondary uses. So an example would be like a neighborhood park it's in your neighborhood. That would be considered part of the neighborhood and part of what makes your neighborhood. Also a smaller elementary school, for example, a church, those sorts of things. Things we used to call out separately are now considered part of neighborhood one. So we're happy to look at the thresholds for the parks and preserves, but that's how it's coded right now.
Okay, thank you. And then my other question is, when you do, and I did find the map, so thank you, and you can, I love that you can click on those comments and see what people have entered in there. So if somebody fundamentally disagrees with the zoning that was applied under the 2040 policy map, what's the process for you all to make the change or not make the change?
So we, at this point, we're not addressing comments, we're really gathering all the comments. We will take those back after we're finished with this portion of the engagement and look at them holistically as a mapping approach. So that's the next step that we will take.
So it could be that your 2040 policy map that you've given us could change?
Yes,
okay.
There will be another version, and it'll again be a draft version because it won't be adopted, but there will be another version that'll be released at the beginning of the year.
And then we'll be in a position to adopt that or not adopt it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Maybe I can emphasize a little bit more on that because that's been a point of confusion. There were people who saw what we used to call a status quo map, and they ran with it that was the place type map, but that's not the case. The reason why we gave you that previous slide was to be able to distinguish between what that adopted policies map is versus what is currently released as a 2040 policy map. But that's a draft. And one thing we're going to do better with the next iteration is to put a huge stamp draft on it, so people don't assume that that's what council will be adopting in February. The process we're going through right now, well, what we have right now is a product of the several weeks of engagement that ended October 1st. But what you're going to see next will be the outcome of input on this particular draft map that you have in front. So this is very draft. People are providing comments. We're gathering them. We're going to analyze them. And then what will come back to you, I believe, before the end of the year will be another draft for you to take a look at. So this is just the beginning of the draft, because we're still going to have to work with our rezoning team as well to make sure that we're aligned with the work they're doing. Because there's a lot of huge rezoning work going on right now. And it's very important for us to be able to make sure that we are in sync with that team. So it's very important for you to help us get that information out also to your constituents. This is draft. We're working on it. Their input during these community conversations is so critical to helping us get to the end of the game.
I have a question. So in this work, as far as parks and preserves, did we set a threshold for traditional open space? When does open space become a park? I mean, how much space do you have? Do you have to have a park? I know some land. Working with Park and Recs, they were trying to assemble 80 to 100 acres to be a park, and then you had Bailey Park, acre, 1.6 acres. So, and that's a park. So when a developer says, okay, I'm going to put some open space in there, at what point can we consider that a park? I mean, is there a threshold amount of acreage or land?
It's parks. The threshold for what is shown on the map in green as a park is 10 acres. But it doesn't mean, again, that a smaller park that's part of a neighborhood or part of a development that's designated a park and is in Park and Rec's inventory, that doesn't mean it's not considered a park. It's just part of a different place type, if that makes sense.
But an actual park is owned by the county. The county has liabilities related to it, and it's accessible by the public. Open space is private property.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
So the owner of that property does have the right to restrict access to it.
Yes.
So it's quite a different animal.
Council Member Ajmera has a question.
Yes, I have two questions. Can I go ahead?
Yes, please.
Okay. So, the typo is under place type on slide number 6, where you have 431% increase in parks and preserves. So how does that help address our tree canopy loss? And what are we doing, what measures are we taking to address significant tree loss? And also, if you can also address how are we strengthening our preservation fund? I know we have heard loud and clear from constituents and also from our city arborists around how we have funding gaps when it comes to our tree preservation fund. So I just wanted to hear action steps that we are taking to address those items.
Good question, Councilmember Ajmera. What I'll suggest is that we put that in the refrigerator right now and then come back to it, because the UDO team and Team Porter will be addressing that very question specifically, or those two questions when they get to that point. So I see the connection between the parks and preserve, but I think where you get the meat of that answer will be when we get to the UDO piece. So if you will give us a minute, we'll get there shortly. Yes.
Okay. I've got several questions, but I think I'll just capture a few for now. I will send you my comments I might just give you this book back with my marker. But a couple of things that I have questions about. I did go online to look at the interactive map, but I wasn't super clear how to tell what the subtypes are. Like if you're in 1A, B, C.
The zoning district, the place types don't have subtypes, but there will be zoning districts that are tied to them. Those are not on the map.
Okay, that's what I thought. So, all right. When can we see those? Because I see that in the UDO, there are some things that say this only applies to certain, what you call them, zoning districts. And so I'd like to understand exactly what is where before, or as I'm reading this, to make sure I understand what's applicable to each lot.
Councilwoman, is this on? Can you hear me? We're going to talk a little bit about how that translates and what the zoning districts look like when we get to the UDO part and walk through an example, and I hope that'll make that a little more clear for you.
Okay, I'm clear about how it fits. I just want to see them on the map.
Sure.
When will we see that?
So in the UDO draft right now, there is a translation table, so existing zoning districts and what they will translate to in the new zoning in the UDO once it's effective. I believe in the slides that I don't think we have them in the slides, but we have there are certain zoning districts that are attached to specific place types, and that's already been established also in the UDO as well.
And so where can I look at the map? Like right now I can see N1.
Yeah, there's not a map yet.
Right.
So we're working on a map.
Thank you.
Week.
The next question is as it relates to the overlays. I see we've got a neighborhood character overlay. Is that intended to address some of the things that will come out of the anti-displacement work, or what does that look like? Because as I read the overlay details, it doesn't necessarily call that out as a reason. I see it very specific to like architecture and that kind of thing. So where is the overlay that we've discussed as it relates to neighborhoods that are vulnerable to displacement?
That's also something in the UDO, so do we want to wait and talk about that when we get to the UDO portion?
I'm beginning to think that maybe we should keep going because some of the questions are
Right.
in the UDO. And I don't want us to jump to the end because we've had a lot of comments and concerns that were related to the policy maps. I wanted us to address those first, but some of the questions are actually going to be overlay districts, the table of translations. Those will be covered.
Okay, then I'll hold mine to the next section.
And by the way, we can always come back if you feel that that was enough, right? So at this point, though, and I know that we have time and I don't want to hold up anyone, but last 2 weeks ago, I think when we came to council, we also talked about the fiscal impact analysis, which is another thing that actually impacts the policy map. And at that time, we focused on the likeliness study. So I'll hand off to Matt to kind of talk about where we are on that before we go to the mobility plan. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ty. So it's good to be here in person with you all. Next slide, Ty. So we're working on a number of economic analysis, but we want to highlight sort of two that we're working on, and they relate specifically to these three comprehensive plan goals. The first is the likeliness analysis that you all have seen in various presentations. Based on your comments, we've made some taking an alternative approach to look at the issue. So we'll get into that in a second. I also am going to share with you some findings related to the fiscal impact analysis of the map that you are looking at now, the 2040 policy map, in comparison to the status quo, or I should say the adopted policy map. I've been trying to remember to use the correct language. And so first I'm going to talk about the likeliness analysis. So these two maps are ones you've seen previously. The one on the left is an illustration of what we considered based on that methodology to be the more likely lots to potentially redevelop from 1 unit to 2 or 3. And then overlaid with that were the estimated presence of HOAs or CCRs that would restrict that potentially. On the right is a map showing that likeliness analysis with single-family home demolition permits. Really, the purpose of this map was to help illustrate where the market is currently devoid of this policy change, where demolitions of single-family homes are occurring. In most of these cases, what's being replaced on those lots is additional housing, and oftentimes denser housing, because there's additional entitlements that are allowed on those points. But it really shows you, it's an illustration of where market activity is currently for that sort of activity, and something we want to layer into sort of this likelihood analysis. So when we started this analysis, we really underpinned it using actual home sale data. And so this slide presents to you some data that we gathered from the real estate community on actual home sales. And specifically they're for what we're calling attached home sales. And that includes a whole variety of housing product types that are not single-family detached. So it includes duplexes and duets. It includes townhomes. It also includes condo units. And so with the data that we had, this is sort of the set of the types of homes we wanted to evaluate that would be built as part of a redevelopment of a single-family home lot into more than one unit. And as you can see, the chart on the left illustrates the spread of the number of sales by price point or price cohort that occurred over the last year, year and a half. And it's pretty well spread between generally the $250 price range to up to $550. And then the far right being above $550,000. On the right is the geographic reflection of these data. So each point or dot reflects a home sale and its corresponding price cohort in the coloring. So the darker reds and oranges being the $450,000 price points, and above the lighter greens being more that $250 to $350 kind of price range. And so when we originally did our first iteration of this analysis, we were really focused on the types of products or price points that were being achieved in areas where we were seeing those single-family home demolition permits. And those are really more sort of core to the city. And so as you can see on that map, there's a lot more home sales in that sort of $450 and above price point. So based on that, we had developed a prototypical duplex that had 2 units, each one sold for an average of $450,000, and developed sort of backed into a pro forma for how that, what the financial makeup of that development would look like based on those price points. So after we've gained some input from you all and some desire to look at a greater diversity of potential product points, we ended up developing a pro forma for each of the price points that you see on this chart. And so we have a model that's a $250,000 townhome or duplex, a $300,000 duplex, a $400,000, a $500,000, a $750,000, and then up to $1 million for a duplex. And then did a modeling approach that looked specifically at each parcel in terms of its land value in relation to what we thought the achievable price point for a duplex would be in that neighborhood. And so instead of using one sort of prototype and looking at neighborhood-based data, we developed multiple pro formas and prototypes. And so what we found is illustrated on the next slide here, which has 2 maps. The one on the left is our original approach. It shows in red generally the parcels that are most likely to attract redevelopment based on that approach. And again, this is what you've seen previously. And so we found that around 6% of the single-family lots met the criteria that meant they're the highest or most likely to redevelop. It's about 10,000 single-family lots out of the 171,000 lots that are in the neighborhood 1 place types. We found that 6% of those single-family lots that were most likely are in the vulnerable for displacement area. And so comparing that to the alternative approach, we ended up finding relatively similar numbers for our highest likely lots. And so this alternative approach shown on the right has about 7% of single-family lots that meet the criteria that it's likely to redevelop based on its existing conditions. And 8% of those lots are within the vulnerable to displacement area. So a slight increase in terms of the percent of lots that qualified. Some interesting things that we found were a little bit greater diversity and dispersion of potential units under this approach. The other thing we found is a greater diversity of sort of the locations of lots within the vulnerable to displacement area, both sort of east and west of Uptown. And I would say really what drove the inclusion of those lots specifically within this map is they met the criteria for some of those lower price points prototypes, so the $400,000 price points and below. And so illustrating there's likely a little more diverse likelihoodness in this, to say it as simply as I can, in that vulnerable displacement area. But one of the interesting things, though, is that the price points or the models, the price points for the models that actually qualified for those areas are relatively affordable, under $400,000. That's generally 120% of AMI or below. And so if this alternative approach is a reflection of some opportunity for that conversion, at least on this modeling approach, it shows that we might be generating a little more affordable options within those neighborhoods than what was illustrated in the previous approach. I mean, it's a big picture. I think it relatively, two things. It generally is showing about the same results in terms of an aggregate of the citywide. What it's showing, the other point I would say is it's a little more diverse in terms of locations that are most likely. And I think this is even more input or opportunity to use this data to guide efforts related to displacement and other potential impacts of this policy change. And so an interesting suggestion from you all to evaluate a different approach and giving us more data points. And so that is the conclusion of that part. I was next going to move to the fiscal impact analysis, but if anybody wants to dive in and talk about this topic right now, we can do that and then talk about the fiscal impact analysis after that.
Just a quick comment there. You've got 4,880, say, units that are vulnerable. Just note, we have, I think, $17 million that we have identified to fund our anti-displacement efforts. Works out at about $3,000 a location. That doesn't begin to capture the discrepancy between the kind of housing that we want to create and the kind of housing that will occur. And this is not so much for you, Matt. This is another conversation we had about funding for our anti-displacement effort. I'm just highlighting the fact that those units are exposed to replacement.
With this alternative approach we took, we were looking at lower price point units, and some of those lots that showed up in the anti-displacement area are actually in that sort of 400 or below price point, and so they're not necessarily all the higher priced units.
Okay, I get that, but I still think there's an order of magnitude difference between the money resources we have and the number of houses that could be exposed to the kind of redevelopment we don't want.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you.
Yep. Sure.
So in this alternative approach,
Yep.
I see the overlay with vulnerable to displacement, and then the red means alternative approach, likely single-family lots.
Yep.
Can you tell me, how do I interpret this?
Yeah, so the lots that are red were ones that we found that had both, in that neighborhood, could achieve a price point for the different promo models, and also had a land value that was low enough to where it would be feasible to actually buy that home, tear it down, and build 2 units in replacement. And so the red is an indication of potential lots where that type of active, or that development activity might be attractive for developers to consider.
Got it. Thank you.
Yep.
Keep going.
Great. So the other analysis, or one of the other analyses we're working on, and this is something we started within the comprehensive plan process over 2 years ago, and we presented to some of you on this, but we've developed are in continually developing a fiscal impact analysis that evaluates the policy map in front of you. And so there are 4 components to that, and they both either inform or evaluate the map. First is the evaluation of potential growth areas. And so what we're doing with this policy map, that is this draft policy map, is it was run through the community viz model, which then estimates where development is likely to occur throughout the city. and estimates the new number of jobs and households on a specific parcel-based level. And we've used those inputs in terms of the amount of new jobs and new households within, we've mapped those and shown in sort of heat maps, graphic representations where higher concentrations of new jobs or households are likely to go. And what we're doing is we're sharing that with all of our both city and county partners and different departments to start to do a more fine-grained, deeper dive into what the potential impacts on services and infrastructure might be of the map. And so what we're doing is developing these maps and having conversations with these departments where they can start to identify sort of high-level investments that are needed to support growth in areas, highlight concerns with the amount of growth that's forecasted potentially in one area, identify potential policies or strategies we might need to enact or consider to make this growth a reality based on the place type map. And so these conversations are occurring over the next month or two and will inform the next iteration of the policy map, but also future iterations. So it's a representation of our engagement with our partners in each of the departments in both the city and county. The second part of the fiscal impact analysis is the evaluation of the ongoing fiscal impacts. So we've developed a fiscal impact model for both the city of Charlotte and also Mecklenburg County that looks at the general fund for both of those entities and estimates what the annual ongoing impact is of the forecasted growth in 2040. And so that tool is used to evaluate whether or not we're creating fiscal burdens or growing in a more cost-effective manner going forward. We also can use the outputs from the Community Viz model to do revenue forecasting for special districts and special revenue funds. And then we'll also use it as a way to compare some of those infrastructure costs that our departmental partners have identified to the amount of capital funding that will be generated through different sources that the community has, whether that's property tax or sales tax or what have you, and start to illustrate perhaps the return on investment for capturing growth in our centers, for instance, and why that strategy is an effective and a fiscally responsible strategy for the community to grow in. And so this is a lot of the more fine-grained and more number-driven analysis that we couldn't get to within the comprehensive plan policy portion. And now with the map and the data related to the map, we can start to dig deeper and show more of those fiscal impacts. So in summation, we've talked about the likelihood analysis findings and really the market support being the most impactful in terms of driving likeliness for conversion from one unit to two. In terms of fiscal impact analysis, like I said, we did run the 2040 policy map and the adopted policy map through the fiscal impact models to look at that ongoing impact. And what we found is that the policy map actually has a 30% greater net positive fiscal impact. Both maps create a positive fiscal impact ongoing, but the 2040 map is more fiscally beneficial. And I think that's primarily due to the fact that we're trying to capture growth in areas that are, I would say, denser, so our activity centers, and also better suited to capture growth. And so we're growing more efficiently. In essence, it equates to about a 2% reduction in the annual cost to serve the community. And so it's at least illustrating that our policy map, at least how it is drafted now, is creating better fiscal impact or better fiscal outcomes for the community. And that's really the goal, or the goal of the purpose of Goal 10. And we're pleased to see that at least so far it's reflecting that intent. We'll be doing additional analysis of future draft maps as well as those other components that I just talked to, and we'll bring that to your committee and council meetings for future discussion and more deep dive into those issues. But wanted to give you at least an initial overview of what we've found to date. So happy to take any questions on the fiscal impact analysis.
Matt, I remember looking at a report earlier that seemed to indicate that if we did nothing, we would end up with about a $7 million surplus in our budget, and if we did the 2040 plan, we would end up with a $12 million surplus in our budget. At the time in the future when those events occur, our budget's going to be $1 billion or more, well over $1 billion. So That is not significant. I think calling that difference 38% is a little bit of a misrepresentation. It's way below the level of statistical significance. I think the model is a useful tool, although I have some issues with the methodology. But I would really discourage us from going out and saying we're 40% better off using the 2040 plan than if we don't, because the difference is minuscule.
Yeah, so to your point, that 2% estimated reduction in cost can be pretty
2%,
insignificant.
right, not 38%.
Yeah, no,
40%.
comparing the two, it's
Yeah.
30%, but
Yeah.
overall of the total budget, you're right, it's 2% reduction.
That's, I think that's a more meaningful illustration of the magnitude of the difference.
Yep.
That's all.
Yeah,
Thank
no,
you.
That's, yeah, well, point taken.
I think that's a good transition to the strategic mobility plan, and Liz and Ed will walk us through that. We'd like to also make that a point of discussion before we get to the UDO. The reason we're finishing with the UDO is because this conversation on the mobility plan both influence what you just heard and the strategic mobility plan as well. So let me know which sides.
All right. Is this mic on? Is this mic on? Can you hear me?
No, we can't. Yeah, I think you, Ed, you might have
Can
to
you
speak
hear
a little. I don't know if we need to talk about this anymore. Really? Sorry. No, go ahead.
Can you hear me all right? So I'll try to make sure I talk. So yeah, what I'll do maybe quickly, because this really segues to really the UDO discussion, so we want to get to that because this is a good dovetail that, and I know you've had a lot of good discussion about mobility already earlier this morning. So I'll just quickly highlight a few things to kind of tee up really the UDO discussion and the test site that we want to talk about this afternoon. Two things just to say about the slide. Two things we want to talk about is the notion of the strategic mobility plan and the role of that. As you can see, Ty's already described this in the diagram. It's an important part of our policies, sort of our suite of policies to support the comprehensive plan, and it's in line with the policy map in the UDO. The other thing on the slide that's maybe a little bit new to the conversation with council is this thing we're calling a streets manual. And so the way I would describe this, and I'll go through in detail in a slide here, what this is now is the next level of detail that ties the land development, the land use and land development rules and our transportation rules between the UDO, the policy map, and our strategic mobility plan. So it's making sure that we can, as development occurs, really protect for the kind of mobility investment that we want to protect for. The two components, again, that I'll talk about in there is the streets map. I'll mention that in a minute, which is really our arterial system, making sure that we have a vision for what that arterial system looks like, and as development occurs, we're protecting for that system so that we can invest in the kinds of infrastructure that we've been talking about earlier this morning, whether it's mobility for transit, whether it's mobility for priority of bus system, whether it's mobility for bikes and peds. We've got a vision for that. We use the streets map as a way to make sure that as development occurs, we protect for that. The other part here that's part of this manual is what we're calling our comprehensive transportation review guidelines. That is the simplest way to describe that to you is that's really our modernized version of our current transportation impact analysis. You all are obviously very familiar with that conversation related to rezoning. So it's how we, as development occurs, particularly in rezonings in this case, it's today we have a process and a set of guidelines by which we look at mitigation of traffic. We know through the UDO, through the policies that have been in place now and adopted, that we've got to completely think about that in a different way. So I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail. So those are the two things, the mobility plan and this land development transportation tool that we're calling the streets manual. If you go to the next slide, so just real quick, again, a lot of this information we've already talked about. You've had this in your briefing packet. The notion of what the strategic mobility plan is all about, it's really just our plan. We've got, today we do have a plan. It's called our Transportation Action Plan, our TAP. It was adopted in 2017. It reflects our previous policy plans and our previous vision. And certainly now that we've got a new comprehensive plan, we knew it was important that we created the next iteration, the next version of that to support the comprehensive plan. So it's really our transportation plan. It guides the policies, the programs, and the projects and our priorities. So all of this discussion you were having earlier today about how we're going to prioritize things like safety, like pedestrian, like bike, investment. This plan is really, the intent of this plan is to take the broad vision and policies of the comprehensive plan, hone those in now in a little bit more detail so that then we have a more specific set of projects and priorities that will guide the investments that we will make. Specifically, it would guide the decisions that you all would make and think about relative to our capital investment program, making sure that we are prioritizing the right things, the right investment for our plan, our vision, and for council priorities. So just simply thinking about it as the notion of it's really essentially our transportation plan that implements the comprehensive plan that we've already adopted. If you go to the next slide.
Before we do that, Mayor Lyles, I'm told Councilmember Jumeirah has a comment or question.
Yes, I do. As you're explaining strategic mobility plan, can you use a real example?
Example of of a strategic mobility plan, maybe from a peer city, on what it does, what it can do.
Yeah, I mean, let's say this again. So the notion is today we do have a plan. We call it our Transportation Action Plan, and it has policies by defining how we prioritize. A good example is it currently has policies that help us prioritize how we would invest in our sidewalk program. And so, as you know, and we've been having lots of discussions with the council recently about rethinking those priorities, particularly related to our comprehensive plan and the emerging needs, the actual needs that you all are seeing today on the ground. And so, what a good specific example of what this plan will do will be the vehicle by which we will reset what those priorities are and establish in a specific way for our pedestrian and sidewalk program clarity for you and for the public, and clarity that you will give us as staff in terms of priorities as to how we should in this case prioritize the decisions we make about where to invest in sidewalk improvements. Again, the notion there, and again the overall theme, and I think you've talked about it before, is we've got needs that are so great. One of the biggest challenges and really the biggest need we have in a policy plan like this is to establish clear priorities, because at the end of the day we've got resources that are limited, and we've got to make sure that the way we invest and the projects that we invest in are aligned with your priorities and with the established policies that we have in our plans, like the comprehensive plan. The next slide, I won't belabor this, but I want to just to emphasize, again, maybe a little bit more this point about what this plan is about. This slide is the goals and objectives that are already adopted in the comprehensive plan. This is goal 5 of the comprehensive plan. Every word on this slide is essentially in the comprehensive plan as the objectives for mobility generally. And so all I want to make on this point of this slide is the framework of the strategic mobility plan is this. We're building on that framework from the comprehensive plan. What the mobility plan will do is take this level of detail, this kind of vision, and give it sort of more actionable specifics and details, like the example I just mentioned in terms of how we're going to prioritize the investments we make in programs. How do we ensure, in using these goals and these objectives, how do we ensure we use this as the checklist? And are the priorities and the projects and the investments that we're proposing in the plan, do they meet the vision and expectations of these goals and objectives of the comprehensive plan? So I say that all again just to say we're really building on the work of the comprehensive plan and giving it in this mobility plan the level of detail necessary so that we can make more specific decisions around mobility investment.
So Ed, I'm a little confused, and I think the last questioner was, as to how this lines up alongside everything that we've been discussing. So, for example, if anything in this plan calls for money to be spent, capital expenditures, presumably that money comes from the 1-cent sales tax. Is that right?
Not all necessarily. I'll let Liz jump in. Maybe one point I would make that was on, maybe a point I should have made earlier about this difference between our strategic mobility plan and the TMN, which is the strategic mobility plan for the city is what is our city-specific plan for projects and investment. The TMN is what is is an example of a funding strategy, a funding tool by which we would potentially fund some of those projects. We currently and regularly fund our transportation investment through our capital investment program, and our current plan, our current TAP, helps guide some of those decisions that we make now about our capital investment program. This plan would be the next iteration to guide both the decisions you would make around capital investment through the CIP, but also be available. Certainly these projects would be eligible for acceleration or funding should we be successful with the TMN initiative.
So given the other conversations that we've had even today, I think achieving clarity around why these aren't at odds with each other, possibly. So I don't want to have a discussion about sidewalks twice. And if our participation in the larger conversation, the countywide conversation and the regional conversation includes the goals that we have for Charlotte, then would that be this? Or how does this fit into the thing that we're conceiving that will be funded by the 1 cent sales tax?
Sure.
So, great question. I would say for our share of those non-transit or transportation funds that we talked about this morning, the 80-20, the 20% going toward transportation investment, this absolutely sets the framework by which we would make those investments. We're not going to dictate for the rest of the county and the other jurisdictions how they would spend their funds.
Right. So the portion of the funds that we're contemplating in the TMN that relates to Charlotte is then subject to in greater detail allocation in accordance with this plan. This is a
Yes.
Charlotte-specific plan for our share of the TMN. I hope that's clear to everybody.
Just quick clarification, not just our share of the TMN. If TMN doesn't get supported and approved in the future, we still have capital investment in transportation infrastructure, and this will guide those decisions.
Well, that's an important distinction, because are we talking about a contingency with this plan, or are we talking about a portion of the other plan on which we're going full speed ahead?
So this plan doesn't necessarily talk about funding or a funding strategy. This talks more about need and how in which we will build that transportation network to support that need.
Okay. At some point we need to line those things up, right? Right?
So let me make sure I'm clear. I think what you said, Liz, or at least the way that I understand it, this is the framework for all of our capital investments, irrespective of the funding source. So if there is no TMN, this would still guide the decision-making. TMN is just additional revenue, potentially, but it still would fall under this framework.
Okay.
So this will complement CAT's 2030 transit plan.
So next slide. This came up a little bit earlier today with Geraldine's comment about the kind of how we're investing regionally and the challenge we have around mobility investment. I bring this up to kind of emphasize the point. I know we've been having this kind of discussion that essentially we know that the way we invest can't solely be in continuing to invest only in vehicular capacity. We know we just simply can't build ourselves out of that given the pace of growth and the cost of that investment. And so, again, this is just to say one of the philosophies, both of the comprehensive plan for sure, and certainly in the way in which we will drive the decisions and the priorities around the draft of this plan will be to think about how do we not move, reframe our goals. We're not trying to move cars, we're really trying to move people, and we're trying to do that in different ways. And so this illustrates where we are today and thinking about how people move today in Charlotte, and the notion both of the comprehensive plan and the actions of this mobility plan will be to how do we invest, how do we prioritize, how do we incentivize, how do we make that shift so that we're providing and expanding more choices for mobility. That includes all the things that you all been talking about this afternoon: transit, investments in safety, pedestrian, bicycle, innovation in terms of micromobility, thinking about land use. Certainly that's the top of that list is the policy map itself and the vision of the comprehensive plan to make sure the land use decisions we're making provide better connectivity, that places to live and work together, 10-minute neighborhoods, all of those things. So I just put this up to say that we're using that vision from the comprehensive plan and ensuring that the driver of the way we're thinking about this mobility plan is to increase and shift mode and give and provide more flexibility and more choices for how we travel throughout the city.
Can we go back to that slide? I mean, that's a whopping percentage of 77% of us drive alone, and that really eclipses all the other percentages up there. So even from our city of Charlotte's perspective, we don't have any kind of program to try to incentivize carpooling or anything, right? Like Northern Virginia. Where is it? I mean, if we haven't even gotten to 10% yet, so where is it? Where is it effective?
Well, we have CAT's van pool and CAT's motor pool that is not maximized, but it's something that I've talked to John Lewis about, that it is a very regional tool right now that can be utilized, and we just have not prioritized that. So that's something that I would love for us to give more guidance to staff to do, but that's definitely one of the tools in our toolbox.
Yeah, it seems like we should have some goals around that, because right now it just looks like we're just waiting for it to organically manifest itself in something significant. And I really don't see it with that much of a gap between, I mean, hey, people like, I guess we all did come up here alone, I mean, almost, to this retreat. I mean, hey.
I would just add, I mean, you're making a point I probably should have made, which is you're right. The hurdle that we have in front of us as the form and the shape and the pattern of Charlotte, this is one diagnostic of that pattern, and so it's certainly a big challenge. The way we invest is going to be a big part of that, doing all the things you're talking about. And so again, that's having this in front and center for us. So as we're working with CATS, as we're working with the state and the investment that we make in transportation, managed lanes, there's a whole suite of investments and partnerships that we can and should and want to use this mobility plan to make sure that we're focused on, so that we're moving that needle and moving the dial so that we can truly add capacity. Because if you do some of these things right, make good land use decisions, make good transportation mobility investments, you can add capacity, you can move people better without necessarily always having to add travel lanes. And so we've got a long way to go, but it's certainly the point of this is let's identify the problem and let's focus on how we manage that and move to that new vision.
Is tomorrow 2030, or when is tomorrow?
Well, in this diagram, I didn't put any numbers on tomorrow, right? So tomorrow, right now, what this is showing is what is a aspirational expectation. Could we start to shift and add? In this case, the diagram sort of reflects almost like a 50-50 split, right? We've had lots of debate. There's been some interesting conversations recently about, do we set a mode goal? What is that time and horizon? We're sort of trying to grapple with that still, technically in the plans. So more to come and more discussion we would have with you on that. One of the thoughts that I would put in the room is let's and the comprehensive plan does this well. Let's start to put measurable expectations around some of these objectives. A big goal like this is a high aspirational goal, but maybe a better tool for us would be, access goals. Can we expand the population of our city that have, walkable access to a high priority bus route? The investment that CATS talked about earlier today. We can measure that, and we can ensure that in addition to the CATS investment that they're making, that we're putting in the lighting, the sidewalks, the safety to ensure that we can move the needle. And again, the notion here is let's set a access goal that that moves us to a longer-term mode shift. And so maybe to get to your answer to your question more specifically, I think what we want to do is, like the comprehensive plan, use the mobility plan to set objectives, measurable sort of triggers that says how can we increase access to high priority bus? How do we increase access to jobs and services through bike and alternative modes? We can be very specific about that and use it as a way to test and prioritize our investments, and it would be a good checklist for the investments that we make.
Thank you.
Councilman Badrera has a follow-up on the SMP before we move to the next section.
Yes, I have two questions. So first, I just want to clarify that I understood this correctly. The strategic mobility plan helps us prioritize all capital projects. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay, and then second, so how will you all go about prioritization process? We got to balance the aging infrastructure with the growth. So I'm interested in methodology that you're all using to help with the prioritization.
That's the best question, right? Like that's the most important question to this plan. So let me see if I repeat the question right. The question is, what's our methodology by which we're going to prioritize if the mobility plan is the tool that prioritizes our capital investment, what is the methodology by which we're going to come up with that prioritization? And so my short answer to you is we're using, and part of the drafting process that we're in now is to translate the objectives and the vision of the comprehensive plan to the goals, that slide I had up earlier, to measurable things that we could develop a methodology for in terms of prioritization. So for example, on that slide, the six objectives in that included safety, equitable, sustainable. We can, and what we will do and share and be part of the conversation with council, is taking those objectives, establishing some measurable things by which we could establish a prioritization tool, and then as we bring projects in front of council to make prioritization decisions on, we can share that tool as a way for you to help understand and make decisions about how effective these proposed investments are against these goals and essentially ultimately the goals we have in the comprehensive plan. So short answer is we're working on that. We recognize that that's probably the most important thing, and it's really going to be guided by the vision of the comprehensive plan.
Okay, that answers my question. So this will be adopted by, what is the timeline for adoption for this SMP? And would that be part of our overall 2040 policy map? I'm trying to understand the timeline for all of this.
Sure, yeah. There's a slide I think we had at the beginning and at the end we can talk about, but I'll just say it this way, is we've intentionally had the strategic mobility plan sort of follow a step or two behind both the comprehensive plan and the policy map. So two things. Certainly we wanted to follow the vision of the comprehensive plan, but as we've already talked about today, the land use, while the draft of the policy map is out there and it's being refined now, where that finally lands as a land use policy map will influence and should influence the mobility plan and the notion of these investments. So all of that is to say we're following a step or two behind this draft, and the adoption of this plan is following a step or two behind the policy map at this point. So the notion is the policy map gets adopted, I think in the February timeframe next year, we would be sort of a month or two behind that, allowing us essentially to, once you've made a decision about the policy map, we can then spend a little bit of time confirming and working with you to make sure that the mobility plan is completely wired to that and is supportive of that. And so it'll be an adoption you would make sort of following your approval of the policy map, sort of probably in the first quarter of 2022.
So let me check in. I know we're at 3:50 some. We keep going because we've got quite a few things. Okay, all right. So the next, okay, go on.
I'll be quick. The next two things are a little bit detailed, and I'll go through them quickly because I think we can demonstrate them probably better in the example that Allison in planning will talk about. So streets map, I think we got it teed up. If it's possible, you just go to the next slide, and I'll just really quickly show, if you could pull up that interactive map, I'll just really quickly make the point here that the streets map is following the policy map draft. We talked about it just now. There is this interactive map that both has the draft policy map that we just talked about and the streets map. And so while we'll see if we can pull that up. If not, we can move on. If you go to the interactive map for the policy map, there's a layer of that is the streets map, highlights all the sort of the network and framework of our arterial street system throughout the whole city. And so there, this is the actual online map. What we've turned off on this map is the colors and the layers of the policy map, just so you could highlight the lines that show the streets map. If you click on you can't see this level of detail, but when you click on each one, essentially it just tells you the dimension that is the expectation of that future street. And so the simple way to describe it is it's the clearest way to communicate to development as it occurs where we expect that street to be, and so that when they develop, we are protecting for and ensuring that the future multimodal vision of all of these streets is provided for and protected as development occurs. It's built on, so a lot of technical details got us to these numbers, but it's built on the adopted policies that we already have around our bike system, our pedestrian system, our transit system, to ensure that as these streets develop, we have enough room for the bicycle facilities that we're planning, for the pedestrian facilities that we're planning, and essentially assuring that we've got a way to protect for that multimodal infrastructure. So it's a very technical specific thing, but it's really important to the long-term vision. So as we're growing fast, we really need the ability to ensure that development is protecting for that right-of-way for that future investment. If you go to, just to keep moving quickly, the next slide to talk about our comprehensive transportation review process. So that's a long phrase to, again, go back to something that Council is very familiar with, which is our traffic impact study process. We talk a lot about this in rezonings. And so again, the simple way, just jump to the next slide. The simple way to talk about this is, like we're doing with the mobility plan, we recognize that the comprehensive plan, the policy map, all of these dramatically new visions that we have for the city required us at this level of detail to think and modernize completely the way we think about traffic mitigation and the way we review development. Big message I want to send to you today is, historically, we were really focused only on vehicles, right? So we had triggers around how many trips, how many vehicle trips are you creating, and how do we, the whole process was to measure those impacts, the signal impacts of all those new trips. Still valid, still important, but it's clear, certainly from the discussions you're having today and from the comprehensive plan, all the policies that are put in place, it's not just about vehicles, it's about moving people, and it's also about reducing demand. What are the things that we can do to not have trips be made? And then, yes, when necessary and when important, we still measure traffic and still do that traffic impact. So long story short on here, what we're trying to do is create a more comprehensive review, which is, i.e. the name we've come up with, to not just look at vehicle, but look at the multimodal investment, to look at ways that we can reduce demand, transportation demand management. You've maybe seen this on several recent rezonings, some of the big ones where we've gotten the hospitals and some of the big campuses to help think through and commit to programs and investments they can make to support alternative ways of travel, support their employees to not have to drive alone. Those are all part of the tools that we want to wire in this new review process to ensure, in a very transparent way, in a clear way with the development community, but then clear to our community and to council, that we've got a process in a way to ensure that we're getting that investment holistically, moving people, reducing demand, and at the end of the day, yes, managing traffic. That means some new thresholds about this multimodal investment. It means probably adjusting some of the traffic thresholds. We're working on that relative to the draft UDO right now, so we're thinking through what those thresholds will look like. We anticipate having a draft of these guidelines out before the end of the month, and it'll be following the review process and the engagement process that we're doing with the UDO, both with the community at large and with development, the development interests throughout the community. I think that was a lot. I tried to move fast, so that just gives enough, I think, to have a good discussion when we get into the UDO part.
Thank you, Ed. So the plan is that we're introducing you to the strategic mobility plan today because we wanted to make that distinction. The questions that Councilmember Driggs asked earlier are really very important to making that distinction between the SMP and the TMN. So now that we've kind of done that introduction as to how that impacts or that is influenced by the policy map, and now how that will also influence the UDO. The plan is to come to the Transportation Planning and Environmental Committee and do another session with you on the SMP, and then go to full council for that. Because there's a lot of details we still need to really be able to work out, such as the question Councilmember Ajmera asked on the criteria, how do you prioritize, and all of that. So we're going to get to that with you all. But that's not the last you're going to hear of that conversation, because it's going to factor into the UDO as well. So at this point, I'll turn it to Alison Craig and Laura Armand to walk us through the rest. I think the most important part of this will probably be the demonstration.
Great. Thank you, Ty. So I think we're going to kind of skip through some of the slides you've already seen before. I want to mention that the comprehensive transportation review that Ed just talked about is certainly of great interest to the community as well as the development industry because it's an important part of implementing the UDO. And so we've added a section onto the UDO website, so charlotteudo.org, and it's called supporting documents. And so you'll be able to find links to things that CDOT's doing. You'll also find some information about the tree manual when that comes out, as well as information about fees. There are fees in terms of the fee in lieu for Tree Save, as well as the heritage trees that are located there today. So I'm going to skip to the demo. So, Ty, if you could.
Alison, I'm wondering, before you do that, there were a couple questions I have here from Councilmember Ajmera, Councilmember Watlington earlier on. Maybe
Sure.
we can speak to those as well with regards to trees, the fee in lieu, I believe, no net loss, and also overlay district, and then availability of the translation map. So maybe we can speak to those.
Okay, I can do the translation map as part of
Okay.
the demo. Do you want to
Great.
stop on those questions first before we get to the demo?
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Let's do that.
All right, Tim, I think that's you.
Hopefully, okay, it's working. Can we go over those questions one more time? It's been a little while since they're asked.
I think Councilmember Ajmera was asking about what additional things that we're doing as it relates to tree preservation and
Okay.
how we're enhancing the canopy in the
So,
UDO.
okay, in the context of the UDO, well, before I jump into the UDO, one thing we're looking at right now, a foundational element of good tree canopy policy and management efforts is having frequent access, better access to really good data. And traditionally, we've conducted canopy analyses ranging from 3 to 5 years, sometimes longer gaps. We're pursuing a new approach. There's a new product out there now that is a subscription service utilizing artificial intelligence canopy mapping. This is something that could provide canopy analysis updates 2 to 3 years in real time over 2 to 3 years. So that's something we're pursuing. That'd be a constant update coming every 2 to 3 years on our canopy cover, and also a scaled down analysis of how that applies to certain geographies, council areas, place types, etc. Within the UDO, Allison mentioned a couple proposed regulation changes. Is tree safe area is one of the big 3 requirements in the current tree ordinance. In the future tree protection article, we're proposing to increase and align the percentage in single-family subdivision areas from 10% to 15%. Provide more options for how commercial development meets tree save. They'll provide more flexibility. Part of those options is the payment in lieu. So when a site qualifies for tree save, they have the if they qualify for options, they may have the ability to pay in lieu. We're proposing to update that cap for that multiplier. There's a formula that tells development customers how much they have to pay. We're proposing to increase that number to align with current county tax appraisal numbers for land values. So was there anything else in those questions to cover?
Maybe the tree preservation fund.
Okay, yep. So something that features prominently in the comprehensive plan and the UDO is the tree preservation fund, which is the fee in lieu dollars collected during land development permitting. That supports the city's tree canopy preservation program. That program is going to grow and expand in its impact. It'll feature prominently in future policy. It's now connected to regulatory review. There's an option for development customers to donate land directly to the city into that program, so that should increase the amount of protected canopy. It's a land and tree approach, so there should be an increase in the frequency and the acreage of protected land in Charlotte for tree canopy. Presently, that program's conserved about 256 acres over dozens of properties, and there's also 9 acres right now in the real estate process, so that program will continue to grow and expand. The funding for that will continue to be applied to the tree canopy preservation program.
Okay.
I have a question about that. With these new regulations, Allison and Tim, do you ever feel like there might be a need to have tree companies be certified by the city? Because I find that people have complained about trees coming down and the companies cutting them down aren't certified, so they don't necessarily know what the city's regulations are. And if you're increasing the rules out there, which I really am glad to see, how do we know that a company, if a resident just decides to cut down a tree and, it's a 30-foot tree and they hire some company who has no idea what the city rules are, wouldn't that be of a concern to you all?
Yes, and even more so now that we're proposing to begin regulating individual lot development, infill development, if you will, and proposing a heritage tree regulation. So that brings about a lot of protective measures on trees. We want to make sure it's flexible. So we are exploring an idea right now that is not so much a certification, but more of a qualification that would be voluntarily driven, sort of like an industry qualification, that if a certain tree care company or an individual contractor, small business wants to go through some training the city could provide, they could qualify as a Queen City tree care company or something like that, and they'd be highlighted. And that would also feed into, hopefully, the large tree assistance program that we're proposing funding in the UDO be connected to mitigation processes there. So hopefully that would assist low-income property owners take care of the large trees that may be on their properties, especially now if they're potentially going to be protected by ordinance in the future.
And I get that, but it's expensive to take a big tree down. And we've probably all heard from residents saying, I have this tree on my lot, I'm afraid it's going to fall and hit my house. And you guys have gone out there and said, no, it's a perfectly healthy tree. You don't want, you don't give you're not going to give you're not going to send the city out to do it. They're going to hire the cheapest company out there to cut a tree down. And chances are they're not going to be the top of the line one that goes through a certification program or whatever. So I have concerns about that. And I've seen it happen. So I would love to see us tighten that up a little bit.
So any changes to the preservation fund and how it's currently being used?
There are no proposed changes. There's language proposed in the UDO to better clarify the intent and purpose of that funding, to apply to conservation, to support purchase of conservation land and management of that land. So no, there's no proposed change to the intent and purpose or use of that funding.
Great. So we're going to continue to use it for preservation and conservation.
Yes, some of that funding may support tree planting on conservation properties, but only in that context, not a broader context. Yes.
Got it. Thanks.
I think Councilmember Winston has a question.
I was just going to comment after Mayor Pro Tem's comment. I definitely, as you know, regulations get tightened, you want to make sure the market is aware, and especially in public spaces. But I hope we don't consider making a certain tier system in terms of who can afford to maintain their property in the way that they want to on their private property, and that prices people out of doing that. That's kind of what I just heard. People have different rationales for what they do with their own private property, and I hope we don't go down that path. Thank you.
Okay, great. So we've talked a lot about these various initiatives and what they will do and how they'll shape how Charlotte grows. And what I thought would be really useful is to walk through a specific site and how development opportunities and potential changes once these different initiatives are implemented. So, thank you, Ty. So you can see the slide on the left. This is where we are today. So this is Park Road Shopping Center, so the intersection of Park Road and Woodlawn. And so you can see today the various zoning districts that are in the figure to the far left. I think we have 40 plus various zoning districts today. So the policy map that is out, the draft is out for public review, hoping for February 2022 adoption. And so you can see what that looks like for that particular location. And so the Park Road Shopping Center area has been identified as a community activity center with some neighborhood 2 and neighborhood 1 in the general vicinity of that community activity center. So and I mentioned this a little earlier today, there's a table in the draft UDO that talks about what happens when the UDO is effective, and I want to make sure that it's clear that the UDO adoption is not the same thing as the UDO effective time period. So we are hoping for council adoption of the UDO in July, but there will probably be a 3-month lag as to when it would actually be effective in those zoning districts on the ground, just giving the public and even staff an opportunity to make sure that they're up to speed with the new ordinance. So whenever the UDO effective date is determined to be, the zoning districts of today will directly translate into the new zoning districts that are in the UDO. And so that table of what converts to what is table 3.1, and it's in the draft UDO today. However, the zoning districts that they will translate to may not be what we aspire for them to be per the comprehensive plan and the policy map. And so we'll have to go, much like we did with TOD, and do an alignment rezoning and realign the zoning that's there from the translation to what the zoning district should be according to the policy map. And so you can see, as an example, the Park Road Shopping Center specifically itself is zoned B1 today. It would translate to general commercial and then ultimately be aligned to Community Activity Center 2. And this has real implications for what you can do on that property. As an example, the heights for general commercial are 50, just base, that's the maximum height. You can bonus up to 65. The parking, if you remember the parking tiers, we had a 3-tier parking system. You would have parking minimums and parking maximums for that particular location. Once it's aligned, then the heights would go up, so it would be a maximum height with the ordinance of 90, and you could bonus up to 150 at that particular location, and it would move to a tier 3 parking standard. And so it really does have significant implications and opportunities to implement some of those policies from the comprehensive plan. Next slide. So now I want to look at a specific location. So this is 500 East Moorhead. Probably recognize it. Capiche is the restaurant that's at the bottom. It's 7 stories. It's a mixture of office, retail, the restaurant, and it's got an attached parking deck. Today it is zoned B1 with a PED overlay. If you can move to the next slide, please. The future land use that's identified in the policy map is regional activity center, so much different than what it's zoned today. The future zoning district that would be translated to would be a neighborhood center, which is a lot less intense than a regional activity center. We would ultimately go and align that through the alignment rezoning process in 2022, 2023 to urban edge. And again, I'll talk through the heights. So a neighborhood center, which is what it would be translated to, would have heights of 60 feet in Tier 2 parking again. With the alignment rezoning, that would then go up to 130 feet is the maximum height, and you could then bonus up to 250. So very significant difference in what could be developed there. The uses are a little, are not that different, but there are allowances for things like hotels and nightclubs and healthcare institutions in that particular zoning district of Urban Edge. And then I want to kind of pull the other piece of the transportation over to Ed to talk through what that would look like in terms of applying the comprehensive transportation review and what sort of review would then take place once this is adopted versus now. So Ed.
Yeah, so this takes that diagram I showed you earlier and just applies it to the site Allison was just talking about. So simple, we didn't do the analysis in detail, but this is just to give you a sort of an illustrative example. The idea that we have these three kind of layers, we're trying to move people, in this case a multimodal assessment. Don't need a traffic study to do that. In this case, on this site, there's actually a project that had already been planned to signalize intersections right there in that picture at Caldwell and Moorhead. This was identified as a need to provide better connectivity from a pedestrian standpoint to existing bus routes already on this corridor. And so in this case, that assessment would have just very simply identified that as a planned project. We would have worked through, the fair shares or the rational, amount that this development would be part of that project. But it would be a simple way to identify that investment and have this project be part of making that improvement investment. No study necessary, just a very simple exercise where we would already know the planned project and work with the development as it occurs to help implement that planned project. Reducing demand, this is something we're still working through, and again, I mentioned a couple examples that we've done on big sites, but in this case, again, there's a menu of things that we would work on in this case to identify ways that this project could implement measures that would help reduce demand. Could be coordinating with with CATS to ensure that the employees in this building have access for reduced or paid for transit passes. It could be ensuring that the investment that's made in the building supports bicycle mobility, having a shower facility, for example. So there's a whole menu of things that could be part of that analysis to ensure that a development like this in an urban context that could take advantage of those kinds of programs, we have a way to have that conversation with development as it occurs. And then this is a good example of the last one, managing traffic. This is an urban location. We know there's nothing we would do from a pure vehicular standpoint. We're not going to add lanes in this situation. We're not going to ask for improvements because we're in an urban location. Our investment wants to be about moving people and mobility. So therefore, we don't need to, and we wouldn't expect the developer to do the sort of technical traffic study. We've checked the boxes on these two other important things for us. So it's, again, a sketch example of how we would apply this kind of more holistic, comprehensive review in this location. Not to say, I'll just say this at the end, not to say that applies for every site. So some cases in more suburban places where there are vehicular transportation investments, certainly our message with this comprehensive review is we would still have triggers that would allow us to have those conversations. We just want to make sure that our system is sort of context sensitive and follows and is really supportive of the plans and the zoning district in this case and the urban context, and make sure that we've got a process that really reflects that context and those goals.
Ed, can I just say to that, one thing I've struggled with throughout these conversations is somebody in my district says, what are you doing right now that's going to improve the situation on Providence Road? And I'm having a hard time getting from some of these big picture and kind of theoretical observations. I mean, they're saying, are you going to widen the road? Are you going to put some sort of tap the brakes on approvals there so that all the development that could occur doesn't happen and make it even worse? So it would be helpful as we continue talking, if we could, and there are other corridors, I mean, everybody I think has one, but get a little more immediate in terms of recognizing what we're hearing today and what kind of things we can do about it. Thank you.
Thank you. We've got a few outstanding comments or follow-up questions that I'd like us to speak to. But before we do that, I just wanted to show you this schedule. This wasn't meant for you to be able to read it, but they are in your binder. It's just to kind of give you an idea of the engagement activities that we're involved in right now through early 2022. And I mentioned earlier that we've got 6 community conversations on policy map between now and October 31st, and 3 UDO engagements between now and October 31st. But in addition to that, we've got more than that on the UDO piece and also on the policy map. And this Thursday, the map of translation, like Councilman Watlington asked for, will be shared at an event. But we need your help when it comes to this. And the help we need is for you to be able to get your constituents to participate in these conversations, because we only have so much bandwidth with the staff that we have, whether it's planning or CDOT. It's hard for us to be going to one community meeting or another. And we've had requests, Councilman Berguson and I talked about this last week. We've had requests from Steel Creek, from Dilworth, from Elizabeth. And as much as we really want to meet with people one-on-one, we want to be very careful that it's also done in an equitable manner. So we're not meeting with one group over another. So the best way to really achieve that equity is through the community conversations. Perhaps after that is done on November 9, if we feel that we haven't really got into that level, then we can set up an in-person meeting with people where different groups can come together. But this Friday, when we send out the weekly, we will highlight this and make sure that you also are aware of which community conversations and engagement activities are taking place in your specific districts, so you can participate and also drive your constituents. But we definitely want people to participate as much as possible. However, we only have so many people who are going through this while working on the mapping and the exercises at the same time. But I wanted to show you this, and maybe there are comments on this before we go, because I'd like us to address some of the follow-up questions and comments. Alison, you wanted to say something on
Yeah, I
this?
just wanted to add real quick to CLT Planning. You can follow us on Instagram and Facebook. All of these events are on there, and so that's a great place to follow all the different events and where we're going to be and what districts may be included. So please, I encourage you to follow those and ask your constituents to do that as well.
Thank you. So we've got a few other things here, and I will start with that. We had, we've had Mayor Pro Tem asked for clarification on stormwater. We've had that before, so I'd like to go to Mike to address that. Councilman Ajimera wanted a follow-up with team on the trees, and then we still want to talk about the overlay districts. Councilman Badrix talked about a summary, the need for some type of summary for the, we gave you the yellow bag so you can carry that 608 page thing, but we do get that you need a slimmer down version. We'll talk about where we are on that, and then the parking question. So I'll start with Mike Davis.
Sure, I'm happy to speak generally to it, but if Mayor Pro Tem, if there's a question you'd like me to start from.
I think I've asked it before, really. It's just there seems to be a gap with addressing infill development and the pressure it puts on surrounding properties. I don't feel like we really have a tool right now to address that.
So thank you for the question, and I would say if I only had one thing to say on this trip up here, that would have been the thing, is for City Council to be aware that the development regulations that the city's had for at least a couple decades now are very effective for, I'd say, larger format development for dealing with drainage. So if you think about it, kind of our development pattern, our growth pattern over those last couple decades, it tends to be larger format, planned subdivisions, multifamily sites. Our processes and our regulations have worked pretty well to mitigate most drainage issues. What we're seeing in the last few years, and I think what you're pointing out, and what I agree with, is that we really lack the tools today to deal effectively with smaller scale development, particularly when it's infill. and you can just picture, a larger development going in. Maybe there's a stand of trees, or it's just a bigger development, slightly bigger structure with more impervious next to something smaller. That really escapes any form of review today. So probably the biggest thing that we're trying to accomplish through the UDO is to close that kind of gap, to add that to our ability through a review process.
Could I just say to that, as we close that gap and as we look at the trees, I'd be interested to see how that impacts costs, because when you impose those requirements, right, that is a cost somewhere. And since one of our overarching goals is to bring the cost of housing down, we need to be mindful of what we might be giving back by imposing those requirements. Thanks.
I'll just mention that our economic impact analysis for the UDO starts tomorrow, and so we'll be able to look at some of those questions that you're asking.
Wondering if you could elaborate a little bit more on that, the economic analysis for the UDO that starts tomorrow.
Sure. So I'll punt it to Matt. I'll just mention that that does start tomorrow. I think we've got about 25 or so people involved, and we're going to look at different categories, one being sort of a neighborhood one, sort of low-density infill residential areas. We'll look at moderate to high-density mixed-use centers. We'll have a category of manufacturing and logistics and innovative mixed use, and one on suburban office and commercial development, and then finally a category on affordable housing. And so we'll ask people with information on development costs and rental rates and understanding of the ordinance to self-select into one of those different categories. And I'll let Matt talk about the process.
Yeah, so tomorrow is an introduction conversation with the development community around what the potential impacts of the UDO are. And so based on that meeting, we're going to split into at least 5 groups, if not more, and we'll develop 1 or 2 sort of prototypes for each of those groups and try to illustrate the costs and benefits related to the UDO, comparing current zoning to what the future zoning would be underneath the UDO. And so it's a very in-depth conversation with the development community to help, I think, collaboratively understand how the process will change and what that means in terms of costs and potentially savings related to process and other things. And so those conversations start tomorrow. December will be another big round of engagement, and then January will be another one as well. And then ultimately we'll bring those findings and results to you all to understand.
Could I ask about that, Matt? Sure. Which representatives are you talking about? I mean, there's a group that I've had conversations with, kind of an informal group of about 20 representatives, and a couple of them are members of the UDO advisory team, like John Morris, Peter Pappas, Chris Thomas. Are you talking to people like that or their organizations?
Yeah, I'll let Allison elaborate, but we're trying to get a mixture of developers by all sort of product types, also design professionals as well that are very ingrained in sort of actually applying the zoning code to specific sites, and casting as wide a net as we can in that effort.
Yeah, those individuals are involved in the conversation that starts tomorrow.
I know they all know who you are, so just keep in touch with them, okay? Thanks.
Okay, Councilmember Ajimera has a follow-up for Tim, and then we'll go to the Mike. I don't know if you were done with the stormwater.
There's probably more detail that we can cover if people want to know more details. Okay. But I mean, the main message is kind of what we just covered. UDO is the opportunity for us to capture sort of some smaller scale impacts that we've been missing for years.
Okay. Great. Thank you. Councilmember Ajimera, you had a follow-up for Tim.
Yeah, so Tim did address my question around the use of the preservation dollars. Sounds good on that. So to follow up on the stormwater, I see that there will be a review for small development to address the gap. So does that include any additional changes to the stormwater ordinance, or that stays the same? same?
No, there will be new provisions. So the UDO is organized where there are, as I recall, 6 drainage articles, and most of what's in there exists today, things like floodplains, swim buffers, things like that, that are mostly left unchanged. There's a new chapter that really is, can be thought of as almost entirely new. It is a drainage chapter, and it's really meant to ensure that certain just fundamental concepts of drainage are dealt with at a small scale. So again, for comparison, if somebody's building a big subdivision, what we've known how to do for a lot of time now is, all those home builders will build lots, make sure they're all draining in a way that doesn't negatively impact another one, that the infrastructure is the standard. If they're part of streets, we come along and accept it. That's kind of the picture of where we've been before. What we're trying to address now is just picture a single house or a couple houses being built, and what has escaped our review previously now would allow us under the UDO to take a look at that, make sure that any new drainage facilities that might become part of the public system is installed in a manner that's acceptable for us to be able to maintain, would make sure that there's nothing being done in terms of the grading of a lot that might cause, say, upstream flooding. You could have a home downstream of an existing home where someone builds it and they grade their lot in a way that causes water to stop draining and flood an existing property. That's another condition that we had no basis to really catch before. So there are other things like that, but that's just kind of a flavor of the kinds of things that we have seen play out for a few years now, that as we've turned to more of an infill style of development, that we think we can kind of intervene on and get design that does not impede positive drainage.
Okay. Okay, that does not address my question. So in terms, I know we have had a huge backlog for our stormwater requests, almost $1 billion. As a result of this change, do you anticipate having less calls and requests coming for stormwater? I know that's something 10 years or even 20 years down the road, but I'm just trying to understand how will some of this tree ordinance, strengthening of our stormwater, how does that all have a positive net impact on stormwater requests we are getting?
Sure. So the question is just about the relationship of the regulation through UDO and our, I'll say, capital and maintenance program of the infrastructure we already maintain. So I would say in the short term, there's not a lot of connection, because when infrastructure is put in the ground, you want it to last for 50 to 100 years. But the connection is that we need to make sure that the infrastructure that's, when it's put in through development, that it is done in a high quality way that's in a condition that's not going to fail, 5 years after being put in the ground. So what we do through development regulation absolutely impacts what we end up needing to take care of over the long haul. And so as Councilmember Driggs has pointed out just a few minutes ago, there is cost to this, and sometimes just a question of where is the cost of drainage and the facilities meant to accommodate those drainage needs, where is that placed? Part of it is in what all of us pay in terms of our monthly fee to take care of the system, and other costs are borne in terms of how good of a job we do in the initial investment in that infrastructure, which most of it does happen through private development investment. So that's where we're trying to get that balance right.
Yeah, and I think when we look at the cost, we really look at it from the holistic perspective, right? Not just passing the buck to someone else. So I want to make sure as we are looking at the overall cost, we are looking at the cost from the neighbor's perspective as well. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm going to throw this question to our staff, because I think it will be of interest to council members. What does rezoning look like post policy map and UDO?
Thanks, Ty. Yes, I was asked a couple days ago at a meeting. It's like, oh, if rezonings are going to go away, that's what I heard. And I'm like, no, I don't think they are. We do anticipate that the number of rezoning cases will decline. There's a number of cases that come before you all each month that are really a result of outdated policies, outdated maps. And so updating those with the comprehensive plan, the policy map, will really allow an opportunity to focus on rezonings that are a result of maybe an area is changing, maybe there's new ideas. And so we will certainly have rezonings in the future. I wanted to talk a little bit about the three types of rezonings and what that looks like, and Laura can jump in and provide more detail, but certainly we'll still have the conventional and the conditional rezonings. There's an EX rezoning that's in Todd that will be carried forward through more through the urban districts that are in the UDO, and that allows you to modify or alter some like quantitative standards. It won't allow you to change uses, but allow you to make some modifications to those based on new and innovative ideas. What I will say is that right now we only require a community meeting for conditional rezonings, and that will be carried forward for all three types of rezonings. Is there anything you want to add? Okay.
Can I comment on that? So the conventional does not require a community meeting. I believe one of our goals is to have fewer conditional and to have a kind of an environment in which many rezonings can get done on a conventional basis. And that rezoning does give more latitude to the petitioner as to what they do there, because it's not a site map and it doesn't hold all the detail. So what that does in my mind is somewhat disenfranchise local residents and frankly us in terms of that community meeting and our engagement with residents. And one of the antidotes to that was supposed to be the community benefit agreement. Don't want to rekindle that entire conversation, but I have a concern that what we lose in terms of community meetings and engagement through the district rep in a conditional rezoning is not fully offset by the efforts that we're making with community benefit agreements. I think there is a danger that residents feel that they have been moved further away from decisions like that about what happens in their vicinity.
So I think having the community meetings there for all those types of rezonings will help public understand what is being thought of in that particular location, even if it's not a conditional site plan.
Will conditional still be allowed for TOD?
Yeah, conditionals will be allowed for any district. It just, we're trying to, at least if we have conditionals, have simpler, easier for the community to understand, because we'll have better base standards through the UDO.
Can I, just going back to the TOD-EX, when you said it's quantitative, what does that really mean? Like, I understand you can't say, you know, conditional, we want to add a gas station. That's a use, but what is that?
Sure, like the one that has come through council so far is a setback issue. So it reduced the setback number, the minimum setback. And that was because there was a building in the way that they wanted to maintain and put some open space next to it. So it could be, it doesn't include height, but it could be your setback, your yards, your amount of built upon area, some of those things that are numerical in the ordinance, and that there's a strong basis for deviating.
And Laura, you may want to talk a little bit too. The EX provision requires public benefits to be a component of the application. Do you want to talk a little bit about?
Sure, and in that case that we saw, one of the benefits was preservation of a historic building, and another one was providing additional open space. So there are three categories that you can choose from for those public benefits. But if you are deviating from the standards, want to make sure that there is a benefit to the community as a trade-off for deviating from standards.
I think we can wrap up, but I was thinking maybe we wrap up with this one on the bonus menu, and then we will come back to TAP and also council with updates in the near future.
So we, folks are probably familiar with in TOD, we have what's primarily a height bonus, also open space bonus, that allows you to go above the maximum height with provision of certain public benefits. This is what we're proposing at this point in time, that we would expand this beyond the TOD zoning district to all of what we're calling our urban districts, so our centers districts, our industrial mixed use, and even beyond that, some additional districts where you could get additional height if you are actually providing a benefit to the community. And this would happen through the development process, and that's how it's happening now with TOD, and we've gotten a a fair amount of starter money for affordable housing, and that's typically where the development community has chosen to put into the Housing Trust Fund. But we've also recently seen folks looking at other options as well, as we have this, like providing additional street connectivity that benefits our transportation system. So this is a starting point for us. And certainly looking forward to hearing from you guys on are there other things or alternative things we should be looking at.
Yeah, this is something I had mentioned the other day when we went through we had our first crack at the UDO in our action review. I think some of these menu options, especially around transportation, can and should be more transformational in nature. You know, just thinking about the future of automation, for instance, our streets are going to have to be hyper-connected, you know, with 5G technologies, right? Why couldn't that be one of the things, you know, that occurs if you're building past a certain height, that you have to provide some type of wireless infrastructure? That's just an idea, you know what I'm saying, to help us get to those real aspirational transportational goals. Micro mobility lockers, great idea. I don't know how that translates to putting more stories up on a building. It just doesn't seem like an equitable trade-off. So what are the more kind of like future-looking improvements that we can occur? Again, understanding new public or private streets are necessary. We are constantly abandoning rights of ways, you know, from past developments that we thought we might have wanted to use, and 20, 30, 40, 50 years later, we don't. So don't know how that, again, actually translates to building more floors. So hopefully we can get a little more imaginative there.
Thank you. So I just found that Councilmember Ajimera had a question on the trees slide, and I think that's forward. On this slide, we mentioned the 4 tiers? I think it's this one. Yes, under the green area. So can we explain what that is, the 4 tiers under the green area?
So the green area is the evolution of what TreeSave is today. So TreeSave is one of the big 3 requirements. That'll be renamed to green area, and there'll be more options and incentives in there, trying to strike the right balance between preservation and development flexibility. Today, those options apply by center, corridor, and wedge status for a development site. In the future, they'll apply by place types, and they're divided into 4 tiers by place types. Right now, there's essentially 3 tiers because there's 3 types of items in the center, corridor, and wedge framework. In the future, it'll be 4 tiers based on place types.
Team, I think we can close. If Allison will close for us with what that summary that we're going to be sharing with you. Again, like we said, it's a 608-page document. And I know that a number of you have almost finished reading that. But we've heard over and over again that we needed a slimmer down version that people could really go to and say, what's in it for me? How does this impact me? And we're working on that. So after our listeners gone through that, I'll turn it back to Manager Jones.
Thanks, Ty. Yes, so we were preparing a summary. Like you said, it's very challenging to boil down a 608-page document that's regulatory in nature, where every word matters, into that. So it's a combination, the summary document will be a combination of walking you through what you can find in each section and what's important, but then also pulling out some of the conversations that we've already had, some important new concepts that are in here, and putting that in the summary. So we should have that for you next week, right? So it'll probably be somewhere between 11 and 13 pages, so hopefully a little easier for you to navigate, but it'll also help provide a guide for you to walk through the ordinance and find the information that you're looking for.
Manager?
Okay, thank you. And so we have one more item on the agenda for today. Liz Babson is going to give an update on Vision Zero. You may recall that when I tested the agenda with the Budget and Effectiveness Committee, overwhelmingly there was a desire to have an additional discussion about traffic safety. I think I talked to Donata. I know that we have a 6 o'clock appointment. We'll see what flexibility is with that, because I'd like to give you a little bit of an opportunity to get to your rooms before we do the 6 o'clock appointment. And we'd set aside about an hour for this. So with that said, Liz, you're on.
Can all leave now? Okay, great. Just wanted to be sure. Well, thank you, team. I appreciate the opportunity to engage with council. Thank you.
Let's see, is everybody ready? Liz, are you ready? Captain, are you ready? Yes, I think we can hear each other, can we? All right, everybody up? All right, let's rock and roll.
Can you hear me now? Okay. All right. Good afternoon, Mayor and Council. We're here today to provide you with some follow-up information based on your recent discussion at last week's Budget and Effectiveness Committee meeting, where several committee members... You want me to wait a minute? Keep going. Is this one not working? Oh, perfect. Thank you. All right. Where several of the committee members requested more time to discuss traffic safety on our streets. So as a reminder, we were before you on October 4th at a strategy session on this topic. You referred the topic to the Safe Neighborhoods Committee, and we have presented to them. They're going to come back to you in December with an update. Next slide, please. Who's driving the slides? We didn't test that first. Ty just messed us all up. Okay. So real quick, the purpose of our conversation today, I'm going to highlight our complete streets policies. And again, nothing new here, just a reminder to kind of do some level setting as we start to have this conversation about safety on our streets. We're going to review the tools that we have to evaluate safety on our streets and then share examples of some engineering and enforcement solutions that are data-driven in responding to safety on our streets. Next slide, please. And just as a reminder, Charlotte has been a leader in transportation with more than 16 years since we first adopted our first complete streets policies. Next slide, please. Charlotte's past development legacy was focused on travel by car for the last 50-plus years. These images before you show how that focus was really on the vehicle. You'll see lack of sidewalks and pedestrian crossings on some of our busiest thoroughfares. You'll see lots of neighborhoods with cul-de-sacs where streets where cars are the focus, and the only way to get in and out of those neighborhoods is to really make a trip on a major thoroughfare. And pedestrians and bicyclists had to compete on those same very busy thoroughfares against the fast-moving traffic. So fast forward to where we are today, we've got a lot of work to do because, like I said, we spent more than 50 years building a street system that looked that way. But in the last 15 years, with a lot of our Complete Streets policy work, we're continuing to create some great places and building streets that complement our land uses and create places where people have a choice in how they travel. Next slide, please. And then again, just to highlight, we know that designing the street for the context is what creates safe travel. For example, adding bike lanes to our existing streets makes it safer for cyclists. But it also often happens by narrowing travel lanes, which helps slow cars down. Adding new traffic signals and pedestrian crossings makes it safer for pedestrians and cyclists to cross those busy thoroughfares, but it also helps break up long segments of busy thoroughfares by interrupting that free flow travel speed for cars, which helps slow cars down. Next slide. And then just as a reminder, we renewed our commitment to safe streets in 2018 with the creation of a Vision Zero action plan that you, Council, put into place, and it's designed to reduce crashes and eliminate traffic-related deaths and severe injuries. Next slide, please. And then Vision Zero, again, is a data-driven approach in determining the right treatment to address safety on our streets, because what we are learning is that all streets aren't created equally and all crashes don't occur for all of the same reasons. Next slide, please. So again, for Charlotte, our data does show that speeding, distracted driving, and driving while impaired are some of the leading factors that contribute to fatal and serious injury crashes. Last year, CMPD investigated 81 fatalities on our street, and this year we're trending about the same at 70 to date. Next slide, please. And so how do we take that Vision Zero policy and put it into action? Well, we take that local data directly from CMPD and the crash reports, and then we develop a high injury network that represents a network of streets where we see that higher incident of severe and fatal crashes. And here you'll see the 30 corridors that make up our high injury network today. I'll point out all of those fatal and severe crashes occur on only about 10% of our streets. Next slide, please. And so I'm excited to share with you another way that we are continuing to improve the work that we do through technology. This is our newest technology enhancement, and it's in that traffic safety work and data analysis. So we are in the process right now of implementing a new crash analysis tool where we receive those reports from CMPD and they're electronically updated daily. This new system will allow us to do a more comprehensive safety analysis, including things like before and after studies and benefit cost analysis. It allows us to evaluate targeted improvements over time and really tailor the solution to solve the problem. Next slide, please. And so here we'll highlight some examples of some of those tailored solutions that we've implemented most recently in making our streets safer. Next slide. Pedestrian hybrid beacons, you should be familiar with this by now, but I like to take credit for the fact that we were the first city in North Carolina to implement the very first hybrid beacon in the state, and that was in 2007. We're installing these devices on multi-lane thoroughfares where we have those long sections of road between signals that don't offer pedestrians a safe opportunity to cross the street. Majority of these are also being installed to support access to buses at transit stops. And these pedestrian hybrid beacons, again, are an important tool because they interrupt the free flow travel speed along long stretches of road without signals, so they have a direct impact on helping slow cars down. Next slide, please. And leading pedestrian intervals. We were also the first in the state to implement what we call LPI. This operation gives the pedestrian an additional 3 seconds to start their crossing in advance of the green indication for the cars. The LPI is an important tool because its operation also results in an additional 3 seconds of all red time at the intersection where all vehicles are stopped. So what this means is it's an additional clearance interval at that signal where we have LPI in operation. Next slide. Yes. So we can adjust those. 3 seconds is nationally what we're seeing people use, again, because if you're taking that time to provide that leading pedestrian interval, then you're also taking that time away from the vehicle operation at the intersection. And so the 3 seconds, again, is to give the pedestrian the opportunity to get in that crosswalk so that they are more visible and not stepping off the curb. All right. And another device that we are implementing, and we're doing this in partnership with CMPD. We're deploying these on streets throughout the city. We install these on a rotational basis because it helps us maximize the safety benefits, because studies have shown the most effective decrease in speeding is what we see in that first couple of weeks after installation, and after that they're less effective. Next slide, please. Is this you?
So CMPD's role in this is to work hand in hand, of course, with CDOT. When we go and do enforcement actions, or we respond to and investigate traffic accidents, and we see problems that can be solved perhaps through design, we certainly work with the great folks at CDOT to suggest those locations and then implement those locations and study them afterwards. However, when we see an opportunity where enforcement we think can address the issue, we're certainly happy to do so too. Just one example of that is our street racing and drag racing initiative that we did earlier in the year. I'm sure all of you are well versed on that by now, but it was very successful. The Still Creek area was our most prominent area of street racing. We received weekly feedback from our citizens in that area about aggressive driving and street racing, and that's kind of been our benchmark for how are we doing citywide. And I can tell you that our complaints about racing in that area, in that part of town, are down extremely and drastically. So we're happy to present that. Just as a reminder, during the course of that investigation, we wrote 3,500 tickets during 2,500 traffic stops. 2,100 of those were for speeding, 400 for reckless driving, 32 were DWI, 10 were for spontaneous racing violations, which are two cars just happen to wind up in the same spot and take off racing. And we seized 54 vehicles for prearranged racing, and those are all working their way through the court system now. One challenge that we have when we do receive these complaints about drag racing is that many times we find out it's in an area where there is no drag racing, two cars lining up and racing. It's more of a loud muffler, loud exhaust, performance exhaust issue. So we have to do a little bit of investigating to distinguish what kind of problem it is and then direct the proper resources to handle that issue.
I have a question.
Yes.
Are you seeing, when you wrote these many tickets, are you frustrated over the fact that, I don't know how many of them are, reduced or, not really prosecuted aggressively or whatever, because I guess our judicial system has had some challenges too in prosecuting some of these cases. So even though they are written, I'm wondering how many actually are really followed through in terms of the appropriate punishment or whatever.
That would be a question for our district attorney. But I'll tell you this: in law enforcement, you learn pretty early on not to gain your job satisfaction from what happens in court. Or you'll be very disappointed. So I would say that would be a question for the district attorney. They have challenges, true. I mean, they're well documented. Courtroom space, courtroom time, a tremendous backlog. So we understand all of that. But to answer your question, yes, of course, it's frustrating.
So I have two quick questions. For one, now that you've taken the picture, can I have my car back? The other one is, I'll just point out there have been a lot of complaints, like from Waverly, about violations that are reported and on which CMPD is not taking action. So I've explained to people that there are constraints because you have this big commitment to safety, to public safety, and therefore in District 7, in fact, the officers are spread a little thin. But when you get these repeated complaints about disorderly conduct, people congregating, the cars, all of that, it really would be helpful. And I've talked to Captain Dozier about this, and he's very responsive, but I would just make the general comment, I don't think the issue has gone away, and the more sort of responsive we can be, the better. Thank you.
Thank you.
Major, I have similar to what Ed said. I mean, this was a really great operation that you guys undertook with the aggressive driving and drag racing. Can you do that on a spot basis in different parts of town where because I know Ms. Watlington's not here, but there are certain areas that we get emails, and because you get the emails
I do. Yes,
all the time. Is it possible to do sort of little stings or whatever it is that, you've got an officer here, you got another one there, and because I know once they're gone, it's hard to catch them, but it happens on a regular basis. South Boulevard in the South End is every night, 10:30 at night, and so I don't know I'd just like to know more about what you think about that and if there's any solution for that.
That would be, it's one solution. It's an enforcement solution. I think another possible solution would be to partner with our state agencies, our inspection, and there might be an opportunity to refer these folks for a mandatory vehicle inspection to make sure that their exhaust meets with state regulations. We could certainly explore that. But on our end, yes. And how we route those types of complaints, when we realize it's a noise complaint, we route those to the division to handle as a quality of life concern, and then the patrol division led by the captain then formulates the response to that. The mission of the transportation division being DWI focused, traffic safety focused, fatality Vision Zero focused, we don't necessarily utilize those resources to handle the noise complaints that we get for the folks that live near the thoroughfares where they can hear these loud mufflers. But you're right, we do know that it's a concern, it's a valid concern, and we work with those patrol divisions and the community officers in particular to address those concerns. Now, South Boulevard has a lot of cars that travel on it every day, and it's not the same people all the time. We know that. So enforcement would have, I think, a limited effect on the noise that folks hear coming from these thoroughfares, which goes back, to roadway design, a topic that we've, discussed. When we have large thoroughfares that funnel these cars into the city, there's going to be noise that comes from those thoroughfares. That's a side effect from that, and we understand that as well.
Larkin?
On the noise side with the mufflers, are you mostly, or maybe you don't know, is it mostly folks making modifications at home, or is it that there are shops in town that are either doing the work for them or are looking the other way when it comes to inspections and passing them even though they shouldn't?
All of the above.
So is there a way that we could put some pressure on any shops that are potentially exacerbating the problem?
Through regulation, through city ordinance, that is outside of my realm, Councilman. But you can order a customized exhaust on Amazon and have it delivered to your door the next day and put it on yourself. So I think that would the opportunity there would be limited.
Because I recall in the high school days in this city, in Winston-Salem, that people knew where they could take their car and get it passed with darker than legal tint and things like that. And so I just wonder if that's another way to approach it, because I do think a lot of the emails and calls we get are just people with really, really loud mufflers that might or might not be racing, but it is horribly annoying.
It is. We agree.
Ms. Dimple?
Yes, I have two questions.
Okay.
So, what is the coordination CFPD you have seen between the enforcement and the number of speeding cases?
Correlation between enforcement and the number of speeding collisions? Is that the question?
Yes. Yes.
We would have to dive into the data and the crash data and see that, and that is part of the solution that would be provided by the new data analytics that CDOT is bringing on board. But I can tell you, enforcement, hard enforcement in a particular area has an effect, a positive effect, but that effect wanes over time as folks' pattern of life continue and they get accustomed to not seeing blue lights. So it is something that we have to do on a continual basis.
Yeah, just a follow-up on that. I mean, it's not possible to have our police officers in all parts of our city where they're speeding. We've got to find a solution. And I don't really see this presentation addressing an underlying issue here, whether it's speeding cameras, whether it's red light cameras, and so on. But I'm really trying to get to what are the recommendations that staff has to address the underlying issue of speeding on our streets that have taken so many lives. I'm hoping that staff will have some recommendations at our next meeting. Thank you.
Thank you, Denful. I think that they're coming back to the Safe Communities Committee, but I think that they were trying to do some additional analysis, if I recall. Is that correct, Larkin? So there are some things that are going to be looked at and brought back to the committee. I think, just to say this, I think we're getting more quality of life complaints. I think that it's not just the speeding and safety are issues, DUIs and safety are issues. I mean, we're seeing that all the time. But we get so many now, I know someone who calls the police if somebody parks in front of their house. And things like that are going on. It's like, well, this is what I want, or this is what this person is interfering with my quality of life. It's a really tough situation because we can't patrol every complaint that people see as impinging on their way that they'd like to live. And I don't know how we do that, and with the kind of like the mufflers and the dark tinted windows and all of those things, because those are all rules that exist. I think the tougher things that we're asking specifically about is where is there actual loss of life? What can we do for pedestrian and cyclists and people that are driving distracted and not paying attention and doing things like that? So I hope that in some ways we'll kind of prioritize what's really most effective around those areas that we have the most difficulty keeping safe, which I think that it's increasing. It's just very, very tough. So thanks for the job you're doing, and look forward to whatever we can get to. Braxton?
Thank you. I know you probably got a few more slides to get through. I know we did this a couple days ago. One thing I would like for us to consider is the end to right on red lights. I'd like for us to consider that citywide. I'd also, if obviously there might be different appetites in different parts of the city for this, an option for it in the urban core, and roads that are adjacent or intersections that contain bike lanes. Again, getting back to, the mayor's point, what are the common sense ideas that we can do now to make it more safe for pedestrians, bikers, and drivers? And a big way is slowing folks down. And how do you do that? Well, if you make them stop and go in any direction, and you don't have multiple vehicles moving at the same time in different directions, I think that is something that we can do literally today to make people safer in all parts of Charlotte. So I hope we consider that, and I hope we consider more common sense ideas that are happening in different parts of the world that are just we have not caught up to yet because we're still transitioning from that 50 years of the way we've developed our roads. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. We just have a couple more slides, and we can go through those really quickly. Yeah, next slide. Just as a reminder, you know, we've highlighted a few technology solutions that we've implemented most recently to make our streets safer, but I just want to remind you that there's a lot of low-cost options and things that we do on a pretty routine basis throughout the city as needed, and that's the work that we do with installing signs and you know, just trying to make our traffic control devices more visible. Next slide, please. And then last but certainly not least, you've heard me talk about this a couple of times in a couple of different settings, but just want to remind you, again, we're another first. This time we're the first in the country. CDOT, in partnership with CATS and the fire department, have a signal priority project that we deployed a little more than a year ago, and we're the first system in the country where we use this technology system-wide. And what this does for us, to simply describe it, is it provides fire vehicles with signal priority as they respond to calls for service. So with more than 100,000 calls annually in the first full year of operation, we saw a 22-second reduction in response time. For CATS, their service delivery is measured a little bit differently, and so being on time is what's important to them. So when we respond and provide signal priority for buses, we provide that priority service when they're running behind schedule so we can get them back on schedule. And then next slide. This is the last slide just to kind of recap everything. Again, building complete streets for all users is important. That's what keeps our most vulnerable users safer. And historically, based on our data, that's our pedestrians and bicyclists, because they are involved in fatal and serious injuries at a rate far greater than any of our other users of our transportation system. We know that targeted solutions are important, and we know that each crash occurs for a multitude of different reasons, and each area is a little unique. Again, we built for cars for 50-plus years, and as we transition into a transportation network that serves all users in a more equitable way, we're going to have to be very thoughtful about how we make those changes. Again, we'll leverage that new crash database that I talked about to do more of that targeted analysis so we can make sure that we're putting the right solution in the locations and really make the best use of the funds that we have available. And last but certainly not least, we're constantly looking across the country at national best practices in this space of traffic safety on our streets. And with that, I will conclude.
Okay, I'm sorry, Ms. Jackson, who's up next? I know, but I didn't know about the directions for today, for the rest of the... Yeah, housekeeping stuff, yeah. Ms. Jackson, Ms. Jackson's going to tell us the housekeeping. Yeah.
So dinner starts at 6 o'clock. It's a 5-minute walk to Kempton Park Zone, and you're in the Magnolia.
Okay.
Leave our stuff in here for tomorrow.
I will not leave anything valuable in here, but you can leave some notebooks.
That's fine.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, that's it.
All right, then we are adjourned then. Thanks, everyone.
And if people want to get there faster, they can ride with Ed.